What if the greatest German defeat of 1941 wasn't a single battle, but a slow, grinding collapse triggered by a winter the Wehrmacht believed it would never face? The Soviet counteroffensive didn't just save Moscow, it quietly rewired the entire war, forcing Hitler to shift his strategy, abandon key plans, and expose weaknesses no one had imagined. The deeper you go into this forgotten steel blizzard, the clearer it becomes. The Eastern Front's turning point didn't happen in one moment. It unfolded over months of bitter, relentless fighting that both armies tried to survive. The winter of 1941 approached the Eastern Front under conditions that neither side had fully anticipated. For 5 months, German Army Group Center had advanced more than 900 kilometers into Soviet territory, pushing through Belarus and toward the capital. By late November, forward German units reached positions between 25 and 35 kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow, holding towns such as Krasnaya Polyana, Istra, and Solnekhnogorsk. Intelligence estimates inside the Wehrmacht described Soviet reserves west of the Volga as severely depleted, with reports suggesting that the Red Army had lost more than 3 million personnel in the first phase of the campaign. Based on these assessments, the German High Command maintained the expectation that continued pressure could still force a collapse of Soviet resistance before the end of the year. However, the geopolitical context of the conflict had shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union, despite its losses, had mobilized 193 new divisions between July and December 1941. Many consisted of recently drafted personnel from Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia, with an overall reinforcement pool exceeding 1.2 million troops arriving at or near the front between October and mid-December. The transfer of 18 Siberian divisions, 1,500 tanks, and over 500 aircraft from the Far East became possible after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack across the Amur. This strategic reallocation altered the balance of available manpower around Moscow by early December. Civilian conditions in the capital reflected this shift toward endurance rather than collapse. Approximately half of Moscow's pre-war population had been evacuated eastward, including 500,000 industrial workers and their families, while factories dismantled and shipped toward the Urals continued production with minimal interruption. Public sentiment, shaped by state broadcasts documenting both defeats and acts of resistance, centered on the defense of the city as a national objective. The Soviet government remained in Moscow despite the proximity of German forces, reinforcing the perception that the capital would be defended at any cost. German logistics, by contrast, began to break down. Supply lines stretching more than 1,000 kilometers back toward Poland struggled to sustain the daily requirement of 10,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food needed by Army Group Center. Poorly developed road networks and the early onset of sub-zero temperatures caused transport delays. By late November, many units reported fewer than 50% of their authorized vehicle strength operational due to mechanical failures. Winter clothing shortages persisted, with only about 30% of German frontline troops equipped with proper cold weather gear. These deficiencies were not the result of oversight alone. They stemmed from high-level assumptions that the campaign would conclude before winter fully arrived. Strategically, the Soviet High Command recognized a narrow window in which German forces were overextended, exhausted, and undersupplied. Intelligence reports from partisan units, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications indicated that German frontline divisions around Moscow often operated at 50 to 60% of their authorized strength. Several panzer divisions, such as the 2nd and 5th Panzer Divisions, had fewer than 60 operational tanks each by early December. These figures informed Stavka's decision to initiate a coordinated winter counteroffensive across a front stretching more than 1,000 kilometers, with the Moscow axis serving as the central focus. In preparation for this operation, Soviet planners concentrated approximately 1.1 million troops, 7,700 artillery pieces, and around 1,000 tanks in the Moscow defense zone. The plan envisioned a series of simultaneous attacks: the Kalinin front from the northwest, the Western front directly west of the capital, and the Bryansk front from the southwest. The intention was not merely to push German forces away from Moscow, but to inflict sustained attrition that would force the German army into a prolonged defensive posture. As the temperature fell below minus 20 degrees Celsius and ground conditions stabilized, the stage was set for a reversal of momentum. The shift in Soviet strategy, the steady accumulation of reserves, and the deteriorating German logistical framework converged into conditions that would transform the winter of 1941 into the first major strategic crisis for the Wehrmacht. The next days would demonstrate that the perception of Soviet collapse had been premature, and that the coming assault, driven by newly arrived troops, expanding supply networks, and coordinated planning, would challenge the German assumption of inevitable victory. In the early days of December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began along several sectors of the front, marking the transition from defensive endurance to coordinated strategic action. On 5 December, forces of the Kalinin Front launched the first attack north of Moscow, targeting positions held by the German Ninth Army. The following day, the Western Front initiated its main assault across a line extending from Klin to Tula. Soviet infantry divisions, supported by newly deployed tank brigades equipped with T-34 and KV-1 models, advanced against German units that had been weakened by months of continuous operations. Many German infantry divisions operated with between 6,000 and 8,000 personnel, far below their pre-war establishment of approximately 15,000 soldiers. This disparity in manpower contributed to the initial breakthroughs achieved during the opening phase of the counteroffensive. Command structures on both sides responded rapidly to the shifting situation. Soviet strategic planning for the next phase of the winter counteroffensive shifted toward exploiting the disorganization that had begun to appear within Army Group Center. Between 15 and 20th of December 1941, Stavka issued additional directives expanding the operational scope of the attack across a front nearly 1,000 kilometers wide. The objective was not only to force German units away from Moscow, but to deliver simultaneous blows that would prevent the Wehrmacht from forming a coherent defensive line. To achieve this, Soviet command redistributed reserves, transferring 4 rifle divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, and several independent tank brigades toward sectors where German resistance appeared weakest. This redistribution reflected an evolving doctrinal understanding of operational maneuver. Rather than concentrating forces solely on a single axis, Soviet leaders aimed to apply pressure across multiple directions to create cumulative strain on the enemy. Logistical considerations shaped these plans significantly. The movement of reinforcements depended on rail networks that had been partially dismantled during earlier retreats. Engineering units, numbering more than 30,000 personnel across the Moscow zone, worked continuously to restore tracks, rebuild bridges, and clear debris. On some stretches, trains advanced at speeds below 10 kilometers per hour due to damage, yet the repaired lines allowed the daily movement of up to 8,000 tons of supplies toward forward depots. Fuel stocks, which had been a concern in November, stabilized as new shipments from the Volga region reached the front. Artillery ammunition production increased, enabling Western and Kalinin fronts to plan operations with daily expenditure rates exceeding 10,000 shells per major sector. German intelligence recognized the growing concentration of Soviet forces, but misinterpreted its purpose. Reports submitted to Army Group Center often suggested that the Soviet Union was committing its last remaining reserves in a final attempt to secure Moscow. These assessments underestimated the Soviet mobilization capacity and contributed to German decisions to hold extended defensive positions. Army Group Center, with roughly 1.1 million personnel still on its rolls, but with many frontline divisions operating at half strength, attempted to reorganize its defensive zones. However, shortages of vehicles, fuel, and winter equipment limited mobility, while the rigid directive against operational withdrawal prevented commanders from consolidating exposed salients. As the Soviet offensive expanded, the weather further complicated German defensive efforts. Temperatures frequently hovered between minus 25 and minus 35 degrees Celsius. Lubricants in German vehicles thickened or froze, reducing operational readiness. Reports from several divisions noted that only 20 to 30% of trucks remained functional. Infantry units faced frostbite cases numbering in the thousands, with some divisions reporting more non-combat casualties from cold than from Soviet attacks during this period. These conditions affected artillery as well. Breach mechanisms malfunctioned, reducing the rate of fire and complicating sustained defensive actions. On the Soviet side, winter conditions also posed difficulties, but Red Army units benefited from equipment better suited for sub-zero operations. Winter uniforms, felt boots, and insulated gloves had been distributed more widely among Soviet formations. Ski battalions, numbering between 700 and 1,000 personnel each, operated effectively in deep snow, conducting reconnaissance, raids, and encirclement maneuvers. These units targeted German supply routes, cutting roads, and capturing depots containing food, fuel, and ammunition. Reports detailing the deteriorating condition of frontline units prompted several commanders to request approval for tactical withdrawals to shorter, more defensible lines. These requests were denied, reinforcing a pattern of static defense that limited the Wehrmacht's ability to respond to Soviet maneuver. Internal correspondence from the period recorded growing tension between frontline commanders, who emphasized the need for flexible tactics and high command directives insisting that all positions be held indefinitely. Soviet assessments in the final week of December identified an opportunity to turn the winter counteroffensive into a broader strategic operation. Intelligence summaries estimated that German divisions along the Moscow axis had suffered cumulative losses exceeding 150,000 personnel since early November. Armored strength had declined substantially, with some panzer divisions retaining fewer than 30 operational tanks. The Red Army, despite its own heavy casualties, maintained numerical superiority on most sectors of the front and possessed growing artillery and aviation support. As preparations for the next phase of the offensive advanced, Soviet planners aimed to push the German line westward beyond Mozhaisk and possibly toward Vyazma. Achieving such a withdrawal would eliminate the immediate threat to Moscow, disrupt German winter quarters, and create conditions for continued operations in early 1942. The evolving momentum suggested that the German advance, which had once appeared irreversible, was now yielding to sustained pressure, logistical strain, and the compounded effects of winter on an already overstretched army. The following weeks would determine whether the Soviet command could convert local successes into a decisive strategic shift across the central sector of the Eastern Front. Soviet forces entered January 1942 with the aim of accelerating the offensive and preventing the Wehrmacht from stabilizing its positions west of Moscow. The first days of the new year saw renewed attacks along the Kalinin, Western, and Bryansk fronts, each operating under directives that emphasized continuous pressure and the destruction of German groupings by encirclement rather than frontal assault alone. Approximately 150 rifle divisions, 20 cavalry divisions, and more than 30 tank brigades took part in these operations across the broad arc surrounding the capital. While many of these formations remained under strength, often numbering between 4,000 and 7,000 personnel, their combined effect produced constant strain on German defensive lines. The German High Command identified several sectors where the situation had become critical. One of the most vulnerable points emerged around the Rzhev-Vyazma salient, where extended German positions created deep protrusions into Soviet lines. Maintaining control over this salient required significant manpower, as its perimeter stretched more than 400 kilometers and demanded continuous patrolling under extreme weather conditions. Despite repeated requests from field commanders to shorten their positions, directives continued to prohibit withdrawals. This decision committed Army Group Center to defending an overextended front that absorbed units needed elsewhere. Soviet operational planning during this phase focused increasingly on mobility and attempts to penetrate the German rear. Cavalry corps, each comprising up to 12,000 personnel, played a significant role in these maneuvers, especially in areas where deep snow limited the movement of mechanized formations. For example, the 2nd and 3rd Guards Cavalry Corps conducted operations southwest of Kalinin, crossing frozen rivers and bypassing fortified strongpoints. These units disrupted German supply routes by targeting rail lines and depots containing winter fuel reserves. German rear area authorities also attempted evacuations in regions at risk of encirclement, but the lack of transport vehicles and the speed of Soviet cavalry raids made such efforts incomplete. By mid-January, Soviet forces achieved a series of localized breakthroughs. The Kalinin front advanced toward the Volga River, capturing several fortified settlements that had anchored the northern segment of the German defensive line. The Western Front made further gains near Mojaisk and Borodino, leveraging the weakened state of German infantry divisions that often operated with fewer than 5,000 combat-capable personnel. The Bryansk Front, pressing its advantage in the south, forced the German Second Army to abandon several defensive positions that had been held since the previous autumn. Despite these gains, Soviet command encountered operational difficulties that prevented a cohesive breakthrough along the entire front. The depth of snow, limited availability of transport vehicles, and the fragmentation of communications networks made long-distance coordination challenging. Many Soviet rifle divisions advanced faster than their supply columns could follow, resulting in ammunition shortages that slowed their momentum. Artillery units, essential for breaking fortified positions, faced challenges relocating heavy guns across frozen terrain. These factors produced uneven progress, with some sectors moving rapidly while others stalled against organized German resistance. German defenders, though increasingly strained, displayed considerable resilience. Several divisions constructed new defensive lines behind their initial positions, utilizing forested areas, ridge lines, and frozen riverbanks to create natural obstacles. Engineering units erected field fortifications, including trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles, despite the harsh weather. Temperatures fluctuated widely, causing ice crusts to form over snowfields, making infantry advance slower and more exhausting. Medical evacuation became increasingly difficult, contributing to rising non-combat losses from frostbite and illness. German units suffered similarly, though reports indicate that the introduction of additional winter gear, belatedly delivered from Germany, reduced frostbite cases compared to the earlier months. Despite the mounting strain, Stavka maintained its strategic focus on encirclement operations. The desire to achieve a decisive strategic defeat of Army Group Center reflected broader political and military considerations. Eliminating large German formations would shift the balance of power along the entire Eastern Front and potentially disrupt German plans for renewed spring operations. Yet the ability to carry out such encirclements remained contingent on the Red Army's capacity to coordinate long-distance maneuvers across dispersed fronts. German commanders responded to Soviet advances by implementing defensive elasticity where allowed. Though constrained by the prohibition against major withdrawals, German formations conducted localized retreats, repositioning to more defensible terrain features such as forest edges, frozen riverbanks, and ridgelines. These adjustments slowed the Soviet advance and created opportunities for counterattacks that temporarily relieved pressure on threatened sectors. In several cases, German infantry conducted night withdrawals to escape encirclement attempts, aided by the reduced visibility and difficulties faced by Soviet pursuit units in the dark. By late February, the Soviet winter offensive had achieved significant territorial gains and inflicted sustained losses on Army Group Center. However, the ability to achieve a strategic breakthrough remained uncertain. Soviet planning therefore shifted toward a series of concentrated assaults intended to fragment German command cohesion and reduce their capacity to conduct coordinated countermeasures. These operations unfolded across multiple fronts, each confronting distinct terrain, logistical, and operational challenges that increasingly shaped the course of the campaign. The Western Front, holding the central axis of the Soviet effort, prepared renewed attacks toward Gzhatsk and Vyazma. By early March, it fielded approximately 70 rifle divisions and 20 tank brigades, though the effective strength of these formations had diminished considerably. Many rifle divisions numbered between 2,500 and 4,000 combat-capable personnel, less than one-third of their authorized establishment, while tank brigades often operated with fewer than 10 to 12 serviceable tanks. Despite these constraints, the Soviet command sought to maintain pressure through rotational assaults, deploying fresh units where possible while withdrawing exhausted formations for brief reconstitution. German defensive preparations during this period became increasingly sophisticated. Engineering battalions constructed layered defensive belts, incorporating trenches, barbed wire, minefields, and camouflaged firing positions. In forested regions west of Moscow, German units utilized natural terrain features to create interlocking strongpoints that could delay or fragment Soviet attacks. Although many German divisions operated at 45 to 60% of their theoretical strength, the defensive advantage provided by prepared positions, combined with shorter interior lines of communication within the salient, enabled the Wehrmacht to contain many Soviet advances. Air operations continued to influence ground combat. Their initial advance, intended to support a broader encirclement, had outpaced neighboring units and created a salient vulnerable to encirclement. German forces, recognizing the threat, deployed several reinforced regiments and remnants of armored formations to cut off the Soviet penetration. By mid-February, the corridor supplying the 33rd Army narrowed to less than 10 kilometers in width, and by early March, German counterattacks closed it entirely. Efforts to re-establish contact with the encircled Soviet units were launched repeatedly by the Western Front, involving several rifle divisions and tank brigades. However, German defensive fire, combined with the deteriorating condition of the attacking Soviet forces, limited the success of these attempts. The encircled formations, numbering tens of thousands of personnel, faced shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The Soviet High Command issued directives emphasizing the need to disrupt German defensive preparations, interdict supply lines, and force the enemy to commit reserves faster than they could be replenished. This approach, though costly, aimed to degrade the German ability to conduct large-scale operations later in the year. The transition from deep snow conditions to the muddy landscapes of the spring Rasputitsa profoundly altered the tactical landscape. As temperatures rose and frozen ground began to thaw, road networks became nearly impassable for vehicles. Tanks that had maneuvered effectively on compacted snow now bogged down in deep mud, reducing operational mobility to a fraction of winter levels. Supply convoys required twice as much time to deliver ammunition and food to forward units, and in some sectors, deliveries fell by as much as 40%. Infantry movements slowed as well. Soldiers marched through waterlogged terrain that often reached ankle or knee depth, complicating efforts to sustain continuous offensive pressure. German defensive positions benefited significantly from the changing conditions. The Wehrmacht used the early spring period to reinforce its lines, construct new field fortifications, and redistribute limited resources to priority sectors. Engineering units expanded trench systems, laid additional minefields, and reinforced bunkers with timber and earth. Although many divisions remained at reduced strength, often between 6,000 and 8,000 personnel, they compensated through concentrated firepower, artillery coordination, and the tactical advantage provided by defensive terrain. Moreover, as frostbite cases declined with rising temperatures, German infantry experienced a temporary improvement in combat readiness compared to the harshest winter months. In the central sector, the Soviet Western Front continued efforts to break the Rzhev-Vyazma defensive configuration. Repeated assaults aimed at capturing Gzhatsk and cutting the main supply roads leading to Vyazma, but progress remained incremental. Artillery bombardments frequently suffered from ammunition shortages, limiting their ability to neutralize German strongpoints before infantry attacks commenced. When Soviet rifle divisions advanced, they often encountered German counterfire that halted their movement within a few hundred meters of their starting positions. Casualties mounted steadily, with units reporting daily losses measured in dozens or hundreds of personnel without significant territorial gains. The encircled Soviet formations southwest of Vyazma continued to fight under increasingly desperate conditions. Although sporadic attempts were made to reopen a corridor to the trapped units, German defenses proved too strong, and the thaw further hindered movement through the forests and marshes surrounding the salient. Supply drops continued intermittently, but the quantities delivered were insufficient to sustain prolonged resistance. Over several weeks, The encircled forces fragmented into smaller groups, many of which attempted to break out through forested terrain. A fraction succeeded in reaching Soviet lines. Many others were captured or gradually worn down by German operations designed to eliminate isolated pockets of resistance. On the northern axis, the Kalinin Front expanded its operations, but encountered similar challenges. Attempts to advance toward Rzhev from the northwest and west produced limited gains. Soviet forces captured a series of villages and forest clearings, but German defensive flexibility allowed for rapid local counterattacks that contained deeper penetrations. Partisan activity continued to disrupt German supply routes, yet the Wehrmacht compensated by increasing the use of horse-drawn transport and reorganizing convoy escorts. The German command recognized the strategic importance of the Rzhev sector and allocated additional artillery and anti-tank units to critical points along the front. South of the main axis, the Bryansk front resumed operations against German positions, anchoring the Oka River line. Although several Soviet divisions crossed the river in localized assaults, heavy German resistance and poor terrain prevented the establishment of secure bridgeheads. German artillery, augmented by occasional Luftwaffe sorties during periods of clearer weather, targeted Soviet pontoon bridges and crossing points, forcing repeated withdrawals. As the river swelled with melting snow, crossings became increasingly difficult, and the front lines stabilized along most of the sector. Despite the slowing pace of the Soviet advance, the pressure on Army Group Center remained significant. German logistical challenges, exacerbated by partisan attacks and damaged infrastructure, continued to reduce the efficiency of supply movements. Fuel and ammunition deliveries often fell short of requirements, particularly for armored and motorized units that were essential to counteracting Soviet pressure. Reports from several divisions indicated that artillery fire had to be rationed due to insufficient shell supplies, and tank operations were limited by availability of serviceable vehicles and fuel. Soviet command continued to emphasize reinforcement and reorganization. Divisions that had suffered severe losses were withdrawn for replenishment, while newly formed units, many composed of young conscripts with minimal training, were transferred to the front. These replacements increased the numerical strength of the Red Army, but introduced challenges related to combat readiness, coordination, and operational cohesion. Stavka sought to address these issues by concentrating experienced officers and non-commissioned personnel in key formations while distributing recently mobilized troops into supporting roles. By late April 1942, the operational situation along the Moscow axis had stabilized into a complex pattern of limited offensives, local counterattacks, and persistent attritional fighting. The Soviet winter strike had forced the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow and inflicted substantial material and personnel losses. However, Army Group Center remained intact, holding a defensive line anchored by the Rzhev-Vyazma salient. The Red Army maintained the initiative, but lacked the strength to achieve a decisive breakthrough in the central sector under existing conditions. The campaign's next phase would be shaped by the interplay between exhaustion, reconstruction, and the emerging strategic priorities of both sides as they prepared for renewed operations once the spring thaw subsided. As May 1942 began, the winter offensive's momentum had largely dissipated, but the strategic consequences of the preceding months continued to shape the operational landscape. Both Soviet and German commands used this transitional period to reassess their positions, consolidate depleted formations, and prepare for future operations. Although large-scale offensives subsided due to deteriorating terrain and widespread exhaustion, the front remained active through localized assaults, reconnaissance in force, and continuous attempts to probe weak sectors. The Red Army maintained the overarching goal of eventually collapsing the Rzhev-Vyazma defensive system, while the Wehrmacht sought to stabilize its lines and regain sufficient strength to resume offensive operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The Rzhev salient persisted as the central point of contention. It extended more than 160 kilometers into Soviet-held territory and anchored German defensive deployments across the central sector. Despite its exposed position, it held considerable operational value for the Wehrmacht. It served as a base for launching potential future offensives toward Moscow and provided interior lines of communication that allowed German units to reinforce threatened sectors more rapidly than their Soviet counterparts. Recognizing the importance of this position, the German High Command allocated additional artillery, anti-tank units, and engineering resources to fortify the salient's perimeter throughout May. Soviet command, fully aware of its strategic significance, continued to conduct operations designed to wear down German defenses and restrict their freedom of maneuver. The Western Front, under Zhukov, engaged in continuous pressure across multiple sectors, utilizing small-scale assaults supported by artillery barrages. Although these actions rarely penetrated German lines decisively, they compelled the Wehrmacht to maintain high levels of readiness and gradually eroded the combat strength of frontline units. Rifle divisions, though often under strength, rotated through the line to preserve fighting capability, while newly formed tank brigades with limited numbers of operational vehicles provided mobile support where terrain permitted. The Rasputitsa continued to influence operations well into May. Although some roads became partially passable, many remained deeply rutted, limiting the movement of heavy equipment. Soviet artillery often required teams of horses or tractors to reposition guns across short distances, delaying preparations for coordinated attacks. Supplies continued to reach frontline units, but with frequent delays, particularly for ammunition and spare parts. German logistics faced similar constraints. The combination of road degradation, partisan sabotage, and limited transport capacity produced chronic shortages across the central sector. Reports indicated that daily fuel deliveries met only 60 to 70% of required levels, forcing tank units to reduce training and reconnaissance activities to conserve resources. In the northern area of the salient, the Kalinin Front launched several limited offensives aimed at gaining control of forested high ground and cutting secondary road networks that supported German defensive lines. These actions achieved modest territorial gains, typically 2 to 5 kilometers, at the cost of considerable casualties. Soviet infantry faced strong resistance from German units entrenched in fortified log bunkers protected by minefields and interconnected defensive fire. Artillery preparation often proved insufficient to neutralize these positions due to ammunition constraints and the difficulty of adjusting fire accurately in heavily forested terrain. Nonetheless, the sustained pressure forced German units to commit reserves, which reduced their flexibility in responding to Soviet actions elsewhere. Further south, the Bryansk front proceeded with operations intended to secure river crossings and disrupt German supply routes running toward Orel and Bryansk. Although the front achieved local successes by capturing several villages and pushing German units off elevated positions, the terrain, dominated by swollen rivers, marshes, and forest belts, limited opportunities for deeper exploitation. German divisions, despite operating below full strength, used the natural defensive advantages to conduct orderly withdrawals while inflicting steady attrition on pursuing Soviet units. Luftwaffe air support, although reduced from earlier levels, occasionally targeted Soviet river crossings and assembly areas, slowing the pace of operations. The condition of frontline Soviet units emerged as a central concern for Stavka in May. Many divisions had undergone months of continuous combat, with reduced manpower, worn equipment, and limited opportunities for rest. Newly mobilized rifle divisions began arriving at the front, but their training time had been minimal, often 6 to 8 weeks, and their cohesion remained fragile. To offset these limitations, experienced officers and non-commissioned personnel were transferred from veteran units to serve as command cadres. However, this redistribution often weakened the very formations that had maintained cohesion throughout the winter fighting. Despite these challenges, the Red Army continued to demonstrate operational adaptability. Improvements in supply coordination reduced the delays that had plagued earlier phases of the offensive. Field workshops repaired captured German vehicles, supplementing limited Soviet motor pools. Medical evacuation routes were reorganized to reduce fatality rates from injuries and illness. Soviet engineers restored several bridges and rail segments, allowing supply trains to move closer to the front than during the winter months. From the German perspective, May represented an opportunity to restore stability and prepare for future operations. Although Army Group Center remained under constant pressure, the overall situation had improved compared to the height of the winter crisis. Infantry divisions received limited reinforcements, anti-aircraft units strengthened defensive belts, and the Luftwaffe increased reconnaissance flights as weather conditions improved. Importantly, German High Command shifted strategic priorities toward the southern sector, planning major operations for the summer. This meant that reinforcements for Army Group Center remained limited, and divisions defending the WW2 salient were expected to hold their positions with minimal external support. By the end of May 1942, the winter offensive's strategic impact had become clear. The Red Army had forced the Wehrmacht into a lengthy defensive struggle, prevented the resumption of a renewed advance on Moscow, and inflicted substantial losses that could not be fully replaced. Yet the Soviet goal of destroying major German formations in the central sector remained elusive. Both sides now faced the prospect of renewed operations under improving weather conditions, with preparations underway that would determine the next phase of the Eastern Front's evolving strategic balance. By June 1942, the winter offensive had fully transitioned into a prolonged struggle for positional advantage, marked by sustained attrition and the consolidation of gains made during the preceding months. Although the Red Army retained the strategic initiative along the central axis, operational constraints prevented the realization of the decisive encirclements envisioned at the outset of the campaign. Both Soviet and German commands understood that the outcome of the winter fighting would shape the conduct of the summer operations, and each sought to adjust its preparations accordingly. The front line, stretching across forests, marshes, and river valleys, reflected months of continuous combat and the emerging priorities of both armies as they confronted the shifting conditions of early summer. The WW2 salient remained the central concern for Soviet planners. Its continued existence provided the Wehrmacht with a potential springboard for renewed operations toward Moscow, and its interior communications allowed German units to reinforce sectors under pressure more rapidly than the Red Army could. Stavka therefore maintained its focus on limiting German operational flexibility. Throughout early June, the Western and Kalinin fronts conducted repeated probes designed to identify weaknesses in the German perimeter. These operations typically involved reinforced battalions or regiments advancing under artillery fire to test the resilience of enemy defenses. Although the gains were measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, they generated valuable intelligence about German troop dispositions and helped calibrate later offensives. German defensive measures reflected a systematic effort to stabilize the front. Divisions manning the salient's perimeter constructed several new defensive belts, relying on layered trenches, reinforced bunkers, and concealed fire positions. The thaw had dried sufficiently to allow engineering battalions to expand minefields and improve road networks behind the lines, enabling faster movement of reserves. However, German divisions remained significantly below full strength. Reports from early June indicated that many infantry divisions operated at 60 to 70% of authorized manpower, while some regiments remained closer to 50% after winter attrition and limited reinforcements. Artillery units faced ammunition shortages, and armored formations often fielded fewer than 20 serviceable tanks. Despite these limitations, the defensive advantage of prepared positions allowed the Wehrmacht to contain Soviet pressure. Soviet planning sought to exploit any cracks in the German defense. Several rifle divisions reconstituted during the spring entered the front with manpower levels of 8,000 to 10,000 personnel, significantly higher than long-standing frontline units. These formations were often committed to offensive operations shortly after arrival, supported by concentrated artillery barrages aimed at reducing fortified positions. However, the Germans adapted quickly, dispersing their defensive positions to reduce vulnerability to artillery and employing flexible counterattack groups composed of infantry, machine gun teams, and the remaining operational tanks. As a result, Soviet assaults frequently achieved initial penetration, but stalled as German reserves arrived to seal the breach. Partisan activity continued to influence the campaign's dynamics. organized detachments operated throughout the forests of Smolensk and Kalinin regions, targeting railways, bridges, and communications. Their actions disrupted German supply schedules, forcing the Wehrmacht to allocate additional security units to rail protection duties. Although these measures reduced the frequency of large-scale partisan attacks, they diverted manpower that might otherwise have bolstered defensive lines. Moreover, the presence of partisans complicated German reconnaissance, as patrols encountered increasing resistance in previously quiet areas. On the Soviet side, logistical conditions improved gradually. Repairs to critical rail lines enabled more consistent delivery of ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to forward depots. Artillery units, once constrained by shortages, received increased shell allocations that facilitated planned summer operations. However, equipment wear remained a persistent issue. Tanks and armored vehicles that had operated continuously since the winter required extensive maintenance, and spare parts remained scarce. Infantry units, though reinforced, experienced high rates of illness and fatigue due to months of intensive operations, limiting their endurance for sustained offensives. The Bryansk front, operating south of the main axis, shifted its focus toward securing positions along the Oka River and probing German defenses near Orel. Although the terrain allowed for greater mobility compared to the marshes around Rzhev, German forces maintained strong defensive positions anchored on elevated ground and fortified villages. Soviet assaults achieved local gains but failed to create conditions for deeper penetration. Luftwaffe activity increased during periods of clear weather, with dive bombers targeting Soviet concentrations and supply convoys, further complicating efforts to coordinate attacks. Despite limited progress on the ground, Soviet leadership viewed the continued pressure on Army Group Center as strategically valuable. By compelling the Germans to defend the salient and commit resources to the central sector, Stavka aimed to restrict the Wehrmacht's ability to redeploy divisions to the southern front, where German command was preparing for major summer operations. The Soviet approach, anchored in constant attrition, sought to weaken German capabilities across the broader front, even if immediate territorial gains remained limited. From the German perspective, June 1942 marked a critical turning point. High Command increasingly prioritized the Southern Theater, concentrating mobile units and fresh divisions for the forthcoming advance into the Don and Volga regions. This strategic decision meant that Army Group Center would receive minimal reinforcements and limited supplies during the summer. The command was instructed to hold its current positions with existing forces, relying on fortified defenses and efficient use of available reserves. Planning for a renewed offensive toward Moscow was deferred indefinitely. By the end of June, the operational situation along the Central Front reflected the cumulative impact of 6 months of continuous fighting. The Red Army maintained the initiative but lacked the strength to deliver a decisive breakthrough. The Wehrmacht held firm defensive lines but faced chronic shortages and a gradual decline in overall combat effectiveness. The winter strike had reshaped the balance of power, creating conditions in which neither side could achieve rapid movement without significant additional resources. As summer operations began elsewhere on the Eastern Front, the legacy of the winter battles around Moscow continued to influence strategic calculations. The stabilization of the central sector, the exhaustion of both armies, and the emergence of new priorities in the south signaled that the upcoming months would redefine the broader trajectory of the war. By July 1942, the full implications of the winter campaign had become apparent across the Eastern Front. Although the front line around Moscow had stabilized, the cumulative effects of the Soviet offensive continued to shape operational planning for both sides. The Red Army no longer faced the imminent threat of a renewed German drive on the capital, and Army Group Center, once positioned within sight of Moscow, now held a defensive posture dictated by attrition, logistical strain, and strategic realignment toward the Southern Theater. The winter strike had not achieved the decisive encirclements envisioned by Stavka, yet it had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape by forcing Germany into a defensive stance on a sector where it had previously enjoyed operational superiority. Soviet analysis of the winter fighting emphasized both the achievements and the limitations of the campaign. The Red Army had pushed German forces back between 80 and 250 kilometers across a broad front, recapturing hundreds of towns and stabilizing the approaches to the capital. More importantly, the offensive had disrupted German plans for a renewed advance, inflicted considerable losses on personnel and materiel, and compelled the Wehrmacht to commit reserves earlier than anticipated. At the same time, Soviet commanders recognized that their own forces had been strained by nearly continuous operations. Rifle divisions, frequently operating at reduced strength, required rest and reorganization. Tank brigades needed replenishment after months of intensive use. Artillery units, though better supplied than in winter, still faced shortages of transport equipment and spare parts. The Wehrmacht's assessment reflected a similar duality. Army Group Center remained intact, holding the extensive WW2 defensive system and preventing Soviet forces from achieving deeper breakthroughs. German divisions, though under strength, retained cohesion through disciplined defensive practices, prepared fortifications, and concentrated use of limited reserves. Yet German High Command also acknowledged that the winter had imposed losses that could not be fully replaced. Reports submitted in mid-July indicated that some infantry divisions remained below 60% of authorized manpower, while armored formations possessed only a fraction of their nominal tank strength. Supply lines, strained by partisan activity and damaged infrastructure, remained vulnerable despite repair efforts. Strategically, the German decision to shift priority toward the southern front had decisive implications. Army Group Center received only minimal reinforcements during the early summer, and many of its units faced restrictions on ammunition and fuel allocations. The High Command sought to hold the salient with existing forces, accepting that offensive operations in the central sector were no longer feasible for the foreseeable future. This strategic recalibration left the Rzhev-Vyazma line both essential and vulnerable. Essential because it anchored the German central defenses. Vulnerable because it lacked the reserves necessary to respond to a major Soviet breakthrough. Soviet leadership recognized these vulnerabilities, but also understood the operational constraints imposed by the previous months of fighting. Stavka therefore adopted a strategy that combined local offensives with preparation for more extensive operations later in the year. The goals included improving tactical positions, reducing the depth of the German salient, and preventing the Wehrmacht from transferring forces southward. Soviet artillery units increased their rate of fire during July, supported by improved supply deliveries from railheads moved closer to the front. Infantry units conducted reconnaissance in force to probe German defenses and maintain pressure across the salient's perimeter. The continuous engagements generated steady attrition on both sides. German defensive positions, though fortified, faced near-daily bombardment. Soviet divisions, though reinforced, suffered losses as they attempted to capture fortified villages, forest clearings, and heights that the Wehrmacht had integrated into its defensive network. The pattern of fighting often resulted in repeated exchanges over the same ground, with gains measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. Yet this slow, grinding warfare reflected the realities of two exhausted armies operating at the limit of their capacity after 6 months of nearly uninterrupted combat. Civilian populations in the contested regions experienced the lingering effects of the winter campaign. Many villages had been destroyed or abandoned during earlier fighting, and surviving residents faced shortages of food, shelter, and medical care. Soviet authorities initiated limited reconstruction efforts in liberated areas, focusing primarily on restoring transportation infrastructure and securing supply routes. German forces conducted evacuations in areas near the front, though these were constrained by limited transport capacity and the priority assigned to military logistics. By late July, Soviet command completed a comprehensive review of the winter campaign in preparation for planning the next phase of operations. The analysis highlighted several key observations. The Red Army had demonstrated the capacity to conduct large-scale winter offensives, coordinate multiple fronts, and sustain operations over extended distances. It had effectively exploited German logistical vulnerabilities, particularly during periods of extreme weather. At the same time, Soviet command acknowledged persistent shortcomings in coordination, supply management, and the ability to execute deep encirclements under winter conditions. These insights inform the development of future operational plans, including those aimed at reducing the Rzhev-Vyazma salient in upcoming months. For the Wehrmacht, the winter strike forced a strategic recalibration across the entire Eastern Front. The failure to seize Moscow, the heavy losses incurred during the defensive fighting, and the necessity of committing reserves prematurely influenced German planning for the summer of 1942. The decision to concentrate resources in the south indicated a shifting strategic emphasis, but it also revealed the limitations imposed by the winter campaign. Army Group Center, once the spearhead of the German advance, now occupied a largely defensive role, constrained by shortages and unable to undertake major offensive actions without significant reinforcement. In a broader historical context, the winter operations marked a turning point in the war's central sector. They demonstrated that the Red Army possessed not only the resilience to survive initial defeats, but the operational capacity to launch sustained counteroffensives under adverse conditions. The campaign altered the strategic balance by proving that the Wehrmacht could be forced into retreat and compelled to fight protracted defensive battles. Although the winter strike did not deliver a decisive victory, it set the stage for later operations that would ultimately shift the initiative firmly in favor of the Soviet Union. As the summer of 1942 unfolded, both armies confronted the long-term consequences of the winter's battles. The Red Army prepared for renewed offensives aimed at reshaping the Central Front, while the Wehrmacht concentrated its remaining strength in the south. The winter strike that had shaken the Wehrmacht now stood as a foundational episode in the broader struggle for control of the Eastern Front, a campaign that redirected strategic priorities, exposed the vulnerabilities of both armies, and marked the beginning of an extended contest in which operational endurance would prove as important as tactical skill.